The call came during my weekly grocery shopping. Between the cereal aisle and frozen foods, my phone buzzed with news that would shatter everything I thought I knew about my marriage. Ryan had been in an accident. Something about a crash on Highway 16, a delivery truck, and words that made my stomach drop. Critical condition. I abandoned my cart right there, leaving a trail of spilled coffee beans behind me as I rushed through the automatic doors. The January air bit at my face, but I barely noticed. My hands trembled as I fumbled with my car keys, dropping them twice before managing to unlock the door. "St. Mary's Hospital," the caller had said. "Come quickly." The drive was a blur of red lights and honking horns. I must have broken every speed limit, but the cops could write me all the tickets they wanted. My mind raced faster than my car, cycling through worst-case scenarios and desperate prayers. I'm Mia, and until today, I thought I had everything figured out. The perfect husband, the dream house in the suburbs, and in-laws who actually liked me, or at least pretended to. Now all of that was hanging by a thread, and I didn't even know how bad it was. The emergency room was a maze of fluorescent lights and antiseptic smells. A nurse directed me to the surgical waiting area, where I found Linda, my mother-in-law, already pacing the floor. Her perfectly styled hair was disheveled, and her mascara had left dark streaks down her cheeks. "Oh, thank God you're here," she said, pulling me into a tight embrace that felt more controlling than comforting. "They won't tell me anything because I'm not his wife. You need to talk to them." Before I could respond, a doctor in blue scrubs approached us. "Mrs. Walker? I'm Dr. Chen. Your husband is stable but critical. The impact caused severe trauma to his lower spine. We're doing everything we can, but..." The words washed over me like ice water. Spinal injury, possible paralysis, months of rehabilitation. I nodded mechanically, trying to process it all while Linda's quiet sobs provided an unwanted soundtrack to my shock. "Can I see him?" I asked. "He's still unconscious from the surgery, but yes, briefly." Ryan looked small in the hospital bed, surrounded by beeping machines and clear tubes. His face was bruised but otherwise peaceful. I reached for his hand, and that's when I noticed his phone on the bedside table, cracked but still functioning. I don't know what made me pick it up. Maybe it was instinct, or maybe fate has a twisted sense of humor. The screen lit up with notifications from someone named Chloe. My thumb moved before my brain could stop it. "Baby, I miss you already. Last night was amazing. Can't wait until next week." The message preview ended there, but the timestamp showed 6:43 a.m., just hours before the accident. My world tilted sideways as I scrolled through more messages, each one more damning than the last. Photos, plans, promises. A whole secret life hidden behind a 4-digit passcode I shouldn't have known but did because Ryan had used the same one since college. Linda's voice startled me. "Mia, is everything all right?" I locked the phone quickly, sliding it back onto the table. "Fine," I lied, my voice steady despite the earthquake happening inside my chest. "Just checking if he had any important work meetings to cancel." She nodded, buying the lie as easily as I had bought Ryan's for God knows how long. Standing there, watching my husband breathe through machines while his lover's messages burned in my mind, something shifted inside me. The worry and fear didn't disappear, but they made room for something else, something darker and more determined. "I should call Tom," Linda said, referring to Ryan's father. "He's stuck in traffic." "You do that," I replied, my hand unconsciously clenching into a fist. "I'll stay with Ryan." And I would stay, long enough to understand exactly how deep this betrayal went, and long enough to make sure the price for it would be steep. 3 days after Ryan's accident, Linda insisted on hosting a family dinner. I sat at her pristine dining table, pushing overcooked pot roast around my plate while she detailed her plans to move into our house, temporarily, to help with Ryan's recovery. "It's the only sensible solution," she announced, cutting her meat with surgical precision. "Ryan will need round-the-clock care once he's released, and you can't possibly manage alone, dear." The fork in my hand trembled slightly. Every time she said, "dear," it felt like a paper cut to my soul. I glanced at Tom, who studied his plate with unusual intensity, avoiding everyone's eyes. "I appreciate the offer, Linda, but I've already researched home healthcare options." My voice came out steadier than I felt. "The insurance will cover most of it." Linda's knife scraped against her plate. "Insurance? That's so impersonal. Family should take care of family." "Like Ryan took care of his family?" The words slipped out before I could stop them. Tom's head snapped up. Linda's knife clattered against her plate. What exactly does that mean? I forced a smile. Nothing. Just stressed about everything. The lie tasted bitter, like the wine I'd barely touched. My phone buzzed in my pocket, probably another message from Samantha, checking on me. I'd told her everything yesterday, watching her face cycle through shock, rage, and finally, fierce protectiveness. Well, Linda continued, stress is exactly why you need help. I've already started packing some things. The guest room will do nicely. No. The word came out sharp enough to cut glass. I beg your pardon? I said no, Linda. Our house isn't suitable for 3 adults right now. We'll figure something else out. Linda's face tightened like a fist. Mia, I know you mean well, but you're being unreasonable. Ryan needs his mother. Ryan needs a lot of things, I muttered, pushing away from the table. Excuse me, I need some air. I escaped to their back porch, gripping the railing until my knuckles turned white. Behind me, I could hear Linda's voice rising and falling like a tide of complaints. Tom's lower tones responded, though I couldn't make out the words. The door opened and closed softly. I expected Linda ready for round 2, but it was Tom who appeared beside me. She means well, he said quietly. Does she? Or does she just need to control everything? Tom was silent for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice had changed. How long have you known? My heart stopped. Known what? About Chloe. The world tilted sideways. I turned to face him, searching his weathered face for any sign of deception. You knew? He nodded slowly. Saw them together at a restaurant last month. Ryan claimed it was a business dinner, but he trailed off, shaking his head. And you didn't tell me? My voice cracked. Would you have believed me without proof? The question hit like a slap. No, I wouldn't have. I'd have defended Ryan, probably accused Tom of trying to cause trouble. The realization made me sick. Linda doesn't know, he added, and I won't tell her. That's your choice to make. The door opened again, and Linda's voice shattered the moment. There you are. Mia, we need to discuss the nursing schedule. I've already made some calls. Actually, Tom interrupted, I think we should head home. It's getting late, and Mia probably needs to get back to the hospital. Linda's protest died on her lips as Tom guided her back inside. I heard him murmuring something about letting me process things in my own way. Alone again, I pulled out my phone and opened Ryan's messages to Chloe. There were hundreds of them, dating back months. Each one felt like another nail in the coffin of my marriage. A new text appeared. From the hospital. Ryan was awake and asking for me. I looked back through the sliding glass door where Linda was gathering her things, still talking rapidly about care schedules and family duty. Tom caught my eye and gave me a slight nod. It was time to decide, keep playing the devoted wife while my rage ate me alive, or start writing my own ending to this story. I chose the latter. The hospital room felt smaller at night. Ryan lay propped up against white pillows, his face illuminated by the harsh fluorescent lights that made everything look sickly and unreal. I stood in the doorway, his phone heavy in my pocket, watching him tap away at the tablet Linda had brought him. You're late, he said, not looking up. Mom said you left their place hours ago. I closed the door behind me, careful not to make a sound. I had some research to do. About Chloe. His fingers froze mid-tap. The tablet slipped slightly, but he caught it. Who? Don't. My voice came out like steel. I have the messages, Ryan. All of them. The photos, too. He set the tablet aside, his movements deliberate. Mia, whatever you think you found, January 3rd. I pulled out his phone, reading from the screen. Last night was incredible. I can't stop thinking about the way you... Stop. His face had gone pale beneath the bruises. Just stop. Why? You didn't stop. 8 months of messages, Ryan. 8 months of lies. He swallowed hard, his throat working. It wasn't serious. Just a mistake. A stupid mistake that what? That you were planning to end? I scrolled through the messages. Because these plans for a weekend in Miami next month suggest otherwise. I'm paralyzed, Mia. His voice cracked. Isn't that punishment enough? The laugh that burst from my throat surprised us both. Punishment? You think this is about punishment? I moved closer to his bed. This isn't karma, Ryan. This is just bad luck. Bad luck that happened to save me from wasting more years on a liar. Please. He reached for my hand. I stepped back. We can fix this. I'll end it with her. I'll do whatever you want. She already ended it. I watched his face carefully. I called her this morning, pretended to be from Human Resources, checking on her emergency contact information. She was very helpful. Even mentioned she's taking that job in Seattle next month, the one you promised to help her get. Color flooded back into his face. You had no right to what? To know the truth? To understand that while I was planning our future, you were planning hers? It's not that simple. His hands gripped the bedsheets. I love you, Mia. Chloe was she was young, exciting, not tied down with all these family obligations your mother keeps pushing on us. He flinched. That's not fair. Neither is making me play nursemaid while you're texting your girlfriend from your hospital bed. His eyes widened. What? I held up his phone again. Missing you already, baby. Hope the pain meds aren't too strong. We need to talk about our plans. I checked the timestamp. Sent 2 hours ago. She doesn't know about the paralysis yet, does she? Ryan's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. I wonder how she'll feel about those plans now. I moved toward the door. I guess you'll find out, unless she blocks your number like she did mine after our chat. Mia, wait. His voice was desperate now. What are you going to do? I paused with my hand on the doorknob. Nothing. I'm going to do absolutely nothing. I'm going to watch while you explain to your mother why her perfect son isn't so perfect. I'm going to listen while you tell Chloe why those Miami plans are canceled, and then I'm going to walk away. You can't just leave. I need you. No, what you need is a good lawyer. I'll have mine contact yours once you're feeling better. The monitor beside his bed started beeping faster. You're talking about divorce? Now, after everything we've built? Everything we've built? I turned back one last time. You built a fantasy, Ryan. With her, with me, with your whole life. And now it's crumbling. I'm just choosing not to be buried in the rubble. I opened the door to find Linda standing there, her face white with shock. She must have heard everything. Behind me, Ryan was calling my name, his voice rising with panic. I walked past Linda without a word, her perfectly manicured hand flying to her mouth as I passed. Let her deal with the mess her son had made. I had my own life to rebuild. The hospital corridors had never felt so wide, so full of possibility. Each step took me further from the lies, from the pretense, from the life I thought I wanted. I didn't look back. Samantha's studio apartment smelled like coffee and turpentine. I sat cross-legged on her paint-splattered couch, watching her pace between her easel and the window, her dark curls wild with fury. He did what? She stopped mid-stride, coffee mug frozen halfway to her lips. Transferred most of our savings. My voice sounded hollow, even to me. The account's nearly empty. He must have done it right after I left the hospital. That bastard. She set her mug down with enough force to slosh coffee onto her sketches. Can he even do that legally? It was a joint account. I pulled up the banking app, staring at the numbers that had shattered my morning. Technically, he had every right. Right? She snorted. What about what's right for you? What are you going to do now? The question hung in the air like smoke. What was I going to do? The house payment was due next week. Linda had already left 3 voicemails about Ryan's upcoming physical therapy sessions. The walls were closing in, and my safety net had just been yanked away. My phone buzzed. Another text from Tom. Need to talk? Important. I should go, I said, standing. Tom wants to meet. Samantha grabbed my arm. Wait, there's something you should know. She hesitated, chewing her lip. I saw Chloe yesterday, at Bright Tech. My stomach lurched. What? She wasn't alone. She was with Jeffrey Palmer. Ryan's boss? Samantha nodded. They looked close, very close. The pieces clicked together like a poison puzzle. The Seattle job, the sudden promotion Ryan had mentioned months ago, the late-night strategy meetings. How long were you watching them? Long enough to see them leave together, and long enough to overhear something about offshore accounts. The room tilted sideways. Ryan's voice echoed in my head. The company's going through some changes. Big opportunities coming up. My phone buzzed again. Tom, found something you need to see. I have to go. I grabbed my bag, my mind racing. But I need a favor first. Anything. Can you get into Bright System? You did their website design last year, right? She smiled slowly, already moving toward her computer. Give me an hour. Tom was waiting at our usual spot, a quiet corner of the park where he walked his dog every afternoon. Today, he was alone, holding a thick manila envelope. Linda doesn't know I'm here, he said as I approached, and she can't know about this. He handed me the envelope. Inside were bank statements, emails, and photographs. Lots of photographs. Not just of Ryan and Chloe, but of meetings, handshakes, wire transfers, a paper trail of betrayal that went far beyond a simple affair. How long have you known? I asked. About the affair? Weeks? About this? He gestured to the envelope. Since yesterday. Found these in Ryan's home office when we were gathering his things. Does he know you have them? Tom shook his head. But he will soon. Linda's planning to bring more of his work files to the hospital tomorrow. I thought of the empty bank account, of Chloe with Jeffrey Palmer, of all the pieces falling into perfect, terrible place. I need to make some calls, I said, already turning away. Mia. Tom's voice stopped me. Whatever you're planning, be careful. Ryan's not the only one with something to lose. I looked back at him, this man who'd been more father to me than father-in-law. I'm already losing everything. Might as well make it count. My phone buzzed one last time as I walked away. Samantha had sent a single message. You're going to want to see this. I smiled, feeling the weight of the envelope in my bag. Ryan thought he'd left me powerless, penniless, trapped. He'd forgotten one thing. I had nothing left to lose. And sometimes that's the most dangerous position of all. Tomorrow Linda would bring Ryan his files. Tomorrow he'd realize what was missing. Tomorrow the real game would begin. But tonight I had work to do. The documents from Tom and Samantha's findings spread across my kitchen table like a map of betrayal. Each piece told its own story. Offshore accounts, falsified contracts, corporate kickbacks. Ryan hadn't just been unfaithful. He'd been running a sophisticated fraud scheme with Jeffrey Palmer, using Chloe as their unwitting courier. My phone lit up with Linda's name for the 10th time today. I let it ring. The doorbell chimed instead. Through the peephole, I saw Chloe herself, shifting nervously on my doorstep. My fingers curled into fists, but I opened the door anyway. I know you hate me, she said quickly, but there's something you need to know. I stepped aside, letting her enter. She looked smaller in person, younger, scared. Jeffrey knows about the files, she said, perching on the edge of my couch. He's already started moving money. By tomorrow there won't be any trace. How convenient for them. I remained standing, watching her fidget. And you're telling me this because? Because I didn't know. Her voice cracked. About you, about the fraud, about any of it. Ryan said he was separated. Jeffrey promised the transfers were legitimate business expenses. And you believed them. I was stupid. She pulled out her phone, hands trembling. But I'm not stupid anymore. Look. She showed me emails, screenshots, recorded conversations, evidence that made Tom's documents look like child's play. Why are you really here, Chloe? They're planning to pin everything on me. Her eyes welled up. The transfers, the fake contracts, all of it. Jeffrey's already planted documents with my signature. Ryan's going to claim I manipulated company records to embezzle funds. I laughed, harsh and hollow. And now you want my help? I want justice. She stood up, suddenly fierce. They used us both, Mia. Made us think we were special while they turned us into pawns. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here we were, the wife and the mistress, united by the same betrayal. My phone buzzed again, a text from Samantha. SEC filing deadline tomorrow. Palmer making his move. What exactly do you have? I asked Chloe. She pulled out a USB drive. Everything. Account numbers, dates, recordings. Enough to bury them both. I thought of the empty bank account, of Linda's desperate calls, of Tom's warning about being careful. Then I thought of Ryan in his hospital bed, still trying to manipulate everyone around him. If we do this, I said slowly, there's no going back. Not for any of us. I know. She set the drive on my table, next to Tom's documents. But I'd rather go down fighting than let them sacrifice me to save themselves. My phone lit up again. Tom this time. Linda found the missing files. She's heading to the hospital now. The clock was ticking. Once Linda delivered those files, Ryan would know what was missing. He'd realize what we had, what we could prove. We have until morning, I told Chloe. After that, the money disappears and their story about you becomes official. She nodded, understanding the stakes. What's the play? I gathered the documents, adding her drive to the pile. First, we visit my lawyer. Then we make some calls. SEC, FBI, anyone who might be interested in corporate fraud. They'll destroy us, she whispered. No, I corrected her, feeling strangely calm. They'll try, but they forgot something important. What's that? I picked up my phone, dialing Samantha's number. They taught us how to play their game. Now it's our turn to change the rules. As I outlined our plan to Samantha, I watched Chloe's expression shift from fear to determination. We were an unlikely alliance, brought together by the same men who'd tried to tear us apart. Tomorrow, Ryan would learn exactly what it meant to underestimate the women he'd betrayed. Tomorrow, we'd show him that revenge wasn't just about getting even. It was about getting smart, and we were done playing nice. The hospital corridor stretched before me like a gauntlet. 2 FBI agents flanked me, their presence both reassuring and terrifying. In my bag, the USB drive and documents felt like live ammunition. Remember, Agent Torres whispered, get him talking. We need a confession. I nodded, touching the wire beneath my blouse. One shot at this, one chance to make it right. Linda intercepted us outside Ryan's room, her face a mask of fury. How dare you bring them here? He's recovering. Actually, Mrs. Walker, Agent Torres showed her badge. We're here about Bright Tech Solutions. Your son needs to answer some questions. This is your doing, Linda hissed at me. You vindictive little... That's enough. Tom appeared behind her, his hand firm on her shoulder. Let them pass. Ryan was sitting up in bed, scrolling through his phone. His face drained of color when he saw us. What's going on? We need to talk, I said, closing the door behind the agents. About Chloe, about the money, about everything. He laughed, but it was hollow. There's nothing to talk about. You're just bitter about the affair. Bitter? I pulled out Chloe's USB drive. Is that what you call 17 million in fraudulent transfers? His eyes locked onto the drive. Where did you get that? From the person you were planning to frame. I set it on his tray table. Chloe's been very helpful. You can't prove anything. Actually, Agent Torres stepped forward. We have everything we need. Ms. Anderson has already given her statement. Ryan's facade cracked. That stupid bitch. I told Jeffrey we couldn't trust her. We? I pressed, watching him realize his mistake. I mean, he stumbled, then his eyes narrowed. You're wearing a wire. Everything happened at once. Ryan lunged for the USB drive, knocking over his water pitcher. Linda screamed from the doorway. Tom moved to restrain her. It's over, I said, backing away as the agents moved in. The SEC has frozen the accounts. Jeffrey Palmer was arrested an hour ago. You don't understand. Ryan's voice cracked with desperation. I did it for us, for our future. No, I felt strangely calm. You did it for yourself, like everything else. Mom, he turned to Linda, tell them I wouldn't do this. Linda stood frozen, tears streaming down her face. Tom held her steady, his expression grim. Mrs. Walker, Agent Torres began reading Ryan his rights. Wait, Ryan called out. Mia, please, I'm paralyzed. You can't let them take me. I thought of all the nights I'd spent crying over him, all the lies I'd believed. You should have thought of that before you tried to destroy Chloe's life to save yourself. That's what this is about? Her? His laugh turned ugly. She meant nothing, less than nothing. And that's exactly what you meant to me. I turned to leave, but his words stopped me. If you do this, you'll have nothing. I emptied our accounts, remember? You'll be broke, alone. Actually, Tom spoke up, I've already transferred everything back, plus interest. He met Ryan's shocked stare. Did you really think I wouldn't notice you using my old passwords to access the family trust? Linda gasped. Ryan's face contorted with rage. You helped her? Your own son? No. Tom cut him off. I helped justice, something you clearly never understood. As the agents prepared to transfer Ryan to custody, I felt a strange emptiness. This was my victory, my revenge, but it tasted like ash. Mia, Ryan called one last time, his voice small. I did love you, in my way. I paused at the door, looking back at the man I'd once built my life around. Your way wasn't enough. In the corridor, Linda slumped against the wall, sobbing. Tom stood beside her, looking years older. The agents conferred quietly about transport protocols. And me? I walked away, each step feeling heavier than the last. I'd won, but the cost was staggering. A marriage destroyed, a family shattered, lives forever changed. My phone buzzed, Samantha checking in. I ignored it, needing a moment to breathe, to process. Sometimes revenge doesn't feel like victory. Sometimes it feels like surviving a war, leaving you standing in the wreckage, wondering if the price of justice was worth the cost of peace. But at least I was still standing. The courthouse hallway felt like a funeral parlor. I sat on a hard wooden bench, watching Linda pace in her designer suit while Tom studied a water stain on the ceiling. 3 months since Ryan's arrest, and today would decide everything. My lawyer touched my arm. They're ready. Inside the courtroom, Ryan sat in his wheelchair, thinner now, prison pallor making him look older. Our eyes met briefly before he looked away. Behind him, Jeffrey Palmer's expensive legal team shuffled papers, their confidence cracking around the edges. The plea deal presentation began, a drone of legal terms until the prosecutor said, "The defendant has agreed to testify against Jeffrey Palmer in exchange for—" Wait, Ryan's voice cracked through the proceedings. I need to say something first. The judge nodded, and Ryan wheeled himself forward. I gripped the edge of my seat, expecting another manipulation, another lie. I've had time to think, he said, his voice hollow, about choices, about consequences. He turned to face me, about how easy it is to destroy everything you claim to love. Linda made a small, broken sound. Tom's hand found hers. The money wasn't just about greed, Ryan continued. It was about power, control. I thought if I had enough of both, I could keep everything. The perfect wife, the perfect mistress, the perfect life. He laughed bitterly. Instead, I lost it all. Your Honor, Palmer's lawyer started to object. Let him finish, the judge ordered. Mia. Ryan's eyes found mine again. You weren't supposed to be strong enough to leave. Chloe wasn't supposed to be smart enough to keep records. We underestimated you both, and that was our biggest mistake. Palmer stood up, face red. Ryan, shut up. No. Ryan's voice strengthened. I'm done covering for you. Done pretending this was anything but what it was. Fraud, manipulation, betrayal. He looked at the judge. I have additional evidence. Things I kept back. Insurance, I thought, but now... He glanced at me again. Now I know it's time for the whole truth. The courtroom erupted. Palmer's lawyers huddled in panic, the prosecutor quickly conferring with her team. Through it all, I sat perfectly still, watching my husband, soon-to-be ex-husband, demolish the last bridges of his old life. During the recess, I found myself in the bathroom, splashing cold water on my face. The door opened behind me. Chloe. I didn't expect him to break, she said softly. Neither did I. I turned to face her. You're testifying tomorrow? She nodded. Palmer's lawyers tried to buy me off, offered twice what Ryan promised for Seattle. And, a small, fierce smile, I told them to shove it. We shared a moment of understanding, two women who'd learned the hard way that some prices were too high to pay. Back in the courtroom, the plea deal was revised. Ryan's sentence reduced in exchange for full cooperation. Palmer led away in handcuffs, his empire crumbling in real time. Linda caught me before I could leave. He did it for you, you know. Confessing. Trying to make things right. No, I corrected her gently. He did it because he finally ran out of lies. What will you do now? I thought about the accounting classes I'd started, about the small apartment I'd rented, about the future stretching out before me, uncertain but mine. Live, I answered simply. Outside, Tom waited by his car. Need a ride? No thanks. Samantha's picking me up. I hesitated. Thank you, though. For everything. He nodded, understanding all I wasn't saying. You know, revenge isn't always about destroying someone else. Sometimes it's about rebuilding yourself. As I watched him drive away with Linda, I realized he was right. My revenge hadn't been the FBI raid or the plea deal, or even Ryan's confession. It had been the moment I chose myself over the comfortable lies of my marriage. Samantha's car pulled up, music spilling out as she opened the door. Ready? I looked back at the courthouse one last time, at the life I was leaving behind. Yeah, I said. I'm ready. The rehabilitation center's garden was quiet in the morning light. I watched through the window as Ryan worked with his physical therapist, his movements determined but strained. This would be the last time I'd see him. The divorce papers waited in my car, freshly signed. Footsteps approached behind me. Tom. Didn't expect to find you here, he said, joining me at the window. Neither did I. I turned away from Ryan's struggling figure. I came to give these to Linda. I patted my bag containing the divorce documents. She insisted on being the messenger, always trying to control the narrative. Tom's smile was tired but knowing. She's in the cafeteria, practicing what she'll say to him. A nurse wheeled past with supplies, nodding to us both. Through the glass, Ryan's therapist helped him stand, his legs shaking with effort. You know, Tom said quietly, he asked about your accounting classes. Linda told him? No. He saw the tuition payment from the joint account before it was closed. He paused. Said it made sense. You always were better with numbers than he was. The irony wasn't lost on me. All those years managing our household finances while Ryan and Palmer played their games with millions. I got the job, I said suddenly, at Harrison and Mills, junior accountant starting next month. Congratulations. His voice was warm, though I suspect they're the lucky ones. Linda appeared around the corner, her heels clicking sharply against the linoleum. She stopped short when she saw me. Oh. Her hand fluttered to her throat. I thought you were just dropping off the papers. I am. I reached into my bag, but she held up her hand. Wait, there's something you should know. She glanced at Tom, who nodded slightly. Ryan's starting a peer support group here for other patients dealing with similar situations. Similar situations? Men who lost everything through their own actions, Tom clarified. His idea. The therapists think it might help. Through the window, Ryan had progressed to the parallel bars. His face showed concentration, not the smooth charm I'd once fallen for. Good for him, I said, and meant it. Linda took the envelope, her fingers trembling slightly. I never apologized. For how I treated you, for not seeing. Don't. I touched her arm briefly. We all believed what we wanted to believe. She nodded, tears threatening her perfect makeup. Will you ever forgive him? I already have. The truth of it surprised me. But forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting or staying. As if hearing us, Ryan looked up through the window. Our eyes met, and for a moment I saw everything we'd been, everything we'd lost. He nodded once, a gesture of acknowledgement, perhaps even understanding. I turned to leave, but Tom's voice stopped me. The trust fund, he said. The one Ryan tried to access. I've restructured it. Oh? Half will go to Ryan's care. The other half? He smiled. Let's call it an investment in a promising young accountant's future. Tom, I can't. You can, and you will. His tone brooked no argument. Consider it compensation for services rendered. After all, you did expose a major financial fraud. Linda made a small sound of protest, but didn't argue. I hugged Tom, brief but fierce, then walked away. Through the center's glass doors, past the wheelchair ramp where my story with Ryan had shifted so dramatically, into the bright morning light. My phone buzzed, Samantha reminding me about apartment hunting later. Next to her message was an email from Chloe, now working at a startup in Seattle. You should see the compliance protocols I've implemented here, she wrote. No one's getting away with anything. I smiled, starting my car. The divorce papers would reach Ryan soon, but they weren't an ending. Not really. They were proof that sometimes the best revenge isn't about destroying someone else's life. Sometimes it's about rebuilding your own, stronger than before. In my rearview mirror, the rehabilitation center grew smaller, taking with it the last pieces of the life I'd planned. Ahead lay the life I'd chosen instead. I drove toward it without looking back.
My name is Chloe, and this is the story of how my life turned upside down, not once, but twice. I guess I should start at the beginning. I was born to loving parents, Mark and Lisa Smith, in a small suburban town. Dad was a journalist, and Mom worked as a nurse. We weren't rich, but we were happy. Life was pretty normal until I turned 12. That's when everything changed. It was a rainy Tuesday evening, and my parents were driving home from a dinner party. I was at home with my grandma, watching some silly cartoon when the phone rang. I'll never forget the chill that ran down my spine when I heard my grandma's muffled sobs from the kitchen. The next few days were a blur. Mom died on impact, they told us. Dad survived, but barely. When I finally got to see him in the hospital, he was a shell of the man I knew. His legs were crushed, and the doctors said he'd never walk again. "Chloe," he croaked, reaching for my hand. "I'm so sorry, sweetie. I'm so sorry." I didn't understand why he was apologizing. It wasn't his fault some drunk driver had plowed into their car. But as I grew older, I realized he was sorry for what our lives had become, for the struggles we'd face, for the mother I'd lost, for the father he thought he could no longer be. But my dad, Mark Smith, was made of stronger stuff than he gave himself credit for. Once he was out of the hospital and settled into his wheelchair, he threw himself into his work. He'd always been a talented writer, and now he channeled all his energy into his job as an editor at the city's major newspaper. As I entered my teens, Dad made sure I had everything I needed. He encouraged me to join clubs, to make friends, to have as normal a life as possible. But the truth was, I preferred spending time with him. We'd watch old movies together, argue about books, and he'd help me with my homework. When it came time for college, Dad insisted I go away to school. "You need to spread your wings, kiddo," he said. "Don't worry about me. I'll be fine." I was hesitant, but I knew he was right. So off I went to State University, majoring in accounting. It was there that I met Jessica, who would become my best friend. And through Jessica, I met her second cousin, Michael. Michael was kind, funny, and he didn't bat an eye when I told him about my dad. In fact, the first time he met Dad, they hit it off immediately, bonding over their shared love of classic rock. "Your old man's cool," Michael told me later. "And you're pretty amazing for taking care of him all these years." I shrugged it off, but inside, I was glowing. For the first time since the accident, I felt like maybe, just maybe, I could have a normal life. A life with love, laughter, and yes, even a family of my own someday. After graduation, life seemed to fall into place like pieces of a puzzle. I landed a job at the local tax service, and Michael started working as a long-haul truck driver. We dated for 2 years before he popped the question on a crisp autumn evening in the park where we had our first date. I was over the moon, but there was one thing I needed to make clear. "Yes, Michael. But I can't leave my dad. He needs me." Michael's face broke into a wide grin. "I wouldn't have it any other way. We'll all live together. Your dad's apartment is big enough for the 3 of us, right?" The wedding was small but beautiful. Dad insisted on wheeling himself down the aisle to give me away. There wasn't a dry eye in the house. As I stood there, hand in hand with Michael, I felt like I was living a fairy tale. But every fairy tale has its villains, and mine came in the form of my mother-in-law, Karen, and sister-in-law, Emily. From the moment I met them, I could tell they didn't approve of me. "So, your father is handicapped?" Karen had asked during our first meeting, her nose wrinkling as if she'd smelled something unpleasant. "He's disabled," I corrected, trying to keep my tone neutral. "But he works as an editor, Anne." "How nice," she interrupted, clearly uninterested. "Michael, darling, are you sure about this? There are so many nice girls from good families." I felt my face burn with anger and shame. Michael, bless him, immediately jumped to my defense. "Mom, Chloe is from a good family. Her dad's disability doesn't change that. I love her, and that's all that matters." That shut Karen up, but I could see the disapproval lingering in her eyes. Emily, taking cues from her mother, was equally cold towards me. After the wedding, true to his word, Michael moved in with Dad and me. Our life fell into a comfortable routine. I'd go to work at the tax office, Michael would be on the road for days at a time, and when he was home, we'd all have dinner together. But whenever Karen and Emily visited, the atmosphere in our home changed. They'd strut around like they owned the place, barely acknowledging Dad's presence. Once, I overheard Karen muttering to Emily, "It's a shame. Michael could have done so much better. Now he's stuck with this girl and her crippled father. What if they have children? Can you imagine the genes?" I was furious, but I bit my tongue. For Michael's sake, I tried to keep the peace. But it was getting harder and harder. One evening, after a particularly tense visit from Karen and Emily, I broke down in tears. Michael found me in our bedroom, sobbing. Hey, he said, pulling me into his arms. "What's wrong?" "Your mom and sister," I hiccuped. "They hate me. They think I'm not good enough for you because of Dad." Michael's face hardened. "That's ridiculous. You and your dad are my family now. If they can't accept that, it's their problem, not ours." His words comforted me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of our troubles with Karen and Emily. As the months passed, Michael's trucking business began to flourish. He was always on the road, crisscrossing the country in his big rig. I missed him terribly when he was gone, but I threw myself into my work at the tax office and spent my evenings keeping Dad company. One crisp autumn evening, as I was helping Dad into bed, Michael called. His voice crackled with excitement over the phone. "Chloe, I've been thinking," he said. "How would you feel about buying a townhouse? It would be easier for your dad to move around in a wheelchair. He could spend more time outside. Plus, you could have a garden. Something to keep you busy when I'm on the road." The more he talked, the more I warmed to the idea. I glanced at Dad, who was pretending not to eavesdrop. "What do you think, Dad?" I asked, putting the phone on speaker. Dad's eyes lit up. "A garden would be nice," he admitted. "And it would be easier to get outside." That settled it. Over the next few weeks, we threw ourselves into house hunting. We finally found the perfect place, a spacious townhouse with wide doorways, a roll-in shower for Dad, and a beautiful backyard. Taking out a mortgage was scary, but with Michael's income and mine, plus the rent from Dad's old apartment, we managed to make it work. We moved in on a sunny Saturday in spring, and I'll never forget the look on Dad's face as he wheeled himself out onto our new patio. "This is perfect, sweetie," he said, his eyes misty. "Thank you." We spent the next few months settling in, making the place our own. I planted a small vegetable garden, and Dad would sit outside for hours, soaking up the sun and fresh air. It was idyllic. Then came the housewarming party. We invited friends, colleagues, and yes, Karen and Emily. The party was in full swing when they arrived, fashionably late as usual. They sauntered in, eyeing everything with barely concealed envy. As we moved through the house, I could see the wheels turning in Karen's head. When we reached the master bedroom, she turned to me with a sly smile. "You know, Chloe," she said, her voice low. "This would be perfect for Michael and me. Why don't you send your father to a nursing home? Then I could move in here." I felt like I'd been slapped. "Excuse me?" "Oh, don't look so shocked," Karen continued. "Your father isn't, well, he's not a whole person anymore, is he? He doesn't need all this luxury. A nursing home would be more than enough for someone in his condition." Before I could respond, Karen marched out to the patio, where Dad was chatting with some guests. To my horror, she grabbed the handles of his wheelchair and started pushing him towards the driveway. "Karen!" I shouted, running after her. "What are you doing?" "If he won't go to a nursing home, he can stay outside," she sneered. "That's what you wanted, isn't it? For him to be outdoors?" I was shaking with rage and disbelief. Thankfully, Michael had heard the commotion and came running. His face turned red with anger when he saw what his mother was doing. "Mom," he bellowed. What the hell are you doing? Let go of Mark's chair right now. Karen looked shocked at Michael's tone. But honey, I was just. I don't want to hear it, Michael cut her off. You and Emily need to leave. Now. After they left, Michael apologized profusely to Dad and me. I'm so sorry, he said, his voice breaking. I had no idea she would. I'm just so sorry. Dad reached out and patted Michael's hand. It's not your fault, son. Some people, they just can't understand. Life settled into a new rhythm after the housewarming incident. Karen and Emily kept their distance, which suited me just fine. Michael threw himself into his work, taking on more long-haul routes to help cover our new mortgage. I split my time between my job at the tax office and tending to our home and Dad. 2 years passed in the blink of an eye. Our life fell into a comfortable routine. Michael was on the road more often than not, but when he was home, our little family was happy. Dad's health was stable, and he seemed content spending his days in the garden or working on his editing from home. Then came the call that shattered my world. I was at work when my phone rang. An unfamiliar male voice greeted me. Mrs. Thompson? This is Officer Rodriguez from the Highway Patrol. My heart dropped into my stomach. Yes? I managed to squeak out. I'm sorry to inform you that your husband, Michael Thompson, has been in a serious accident. The rest of the conversation was a blur. Words like head-on collision and didn't make it floated around me, but I couldn't process them. It wasn't until I heard myself thanking the officer and hanging up that reality began to sink in. Michael was gone. The next week was a haze of grief and disbelief. I moved through the motions of planning the funeral like a robot, barely able to comprehend what was happening. The day before the funeral, I steeled myself and called Karen. I thought she deserved to hear about her son's death from me, not from some impersonal newspaper obituary. Hello? Karen's sharp voice answered. Karen, it's Chloe, I said, my voice trembling. It's about Michael. He's gone. There was an accident. There was silence on the other end of the line. Then, to my shock, Karen's voice came back, dripping with venom. This is your fault, she hissed. You forced him to work so hard, driving that truck to pay for your fancy house. You killed my son. I was stunned. Karen, that's not. Save it, she snapped. I expect you to give him the best funeral money can buy. But don't expect a penny from us. You made your bed, now lie in it. The line went dead. I stood there, phone in hand, tears streaming down my face. How could she be so cruel? How could she blame me for this? The day of Michael's funeral dawned gray and drizzly, matching my mood perfectly. The church was packed. Michael had been well liked in the community, and it seemed like half the town had turned out to pay their respects. After the service, as people filed past to offer their condolences, I was struck by the absence of Michael's mother and sister. They hadn't even bothered to show up to their own son and brother's funeral. Dad reached out and squeezed my hand. Their loss, sweetie. We're family, and we'll get through this together. As we pulled into our driveway, something seemed off. The lights were on in the house, which was strange, because I was sure I'd turned everything off before we left. Did you leave any lights on, Dad? I asked, frowning. He shook his head. No, I don't think so. As we got closer, I could see movement inside the house. My heart started racing. Were we being robbed? On the day of Michael's funeral, no less? I helped Dad out of the car and into his wheelchair, my mind racing. Should I call the police? But as we approached the front door, I heard familiar voices inside. My blood ran cold as I recognized them. I pushed open the door to find Karen and Emily in our living room, surrounded by boxes and pieces of furniture. What the hell is going on here? I demanded, my grief momentarily forgotten in the face of this outrageous intrusion. Karen turned to me, her face a mask of false sympathy. Oh, Chloe, dear. We're just helping you pack up. After all, you can't possibly afford to keep this place now that Michael's gone. I was speechless. Emily chimed in, her voice sickeningly sweet. Don't worry, you can go back to your father's apartment. It's cozy. I could feel the rage building inside me. Get out, I said, my voice low and dangerous. Get out of my house right now. Karen had the audacity to look offended. This house belongs to us now. All of Michael's property does. We're his real family, after all. Like hell you are, I exploded. Where were you today? At his funeral? Oh, that's right, you couldn't be bothered to show up. Karen waved her hand dismissively. We were busy making arrangements. Now, be a good girl and start packing. We'll need you out by tomorrow. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. These women hadn't shed a tear for Michael, hadn't even attended his funeral, and now they were trying to kick us out of our home? I'm calling the police, I said, pulling out my phone. Karen and Emily exchanged worried glances. They clearly hadn't expected me to fight back. Now, Chloe, Karen began, but I cut her off. No. You have exactly 5 minutes to get out of my house before I call the cops. This is my home. Michael and I bought it together. You have no right to be here. Maybe it was the steel in my voice, or the fire in my eyes, but Karen and Emily finally seemed to realize they'd gone too far. They gathered their things and left, but not before Karen turned to me with a sneer. This isn't over, Chloe. You'll be hearing from our lawyers. The days following Michael's funeral were a blur of grief, anxiety, and paperwork. I threw myself into sorting out Michael's affairs, partly to keep busy and partly out of fear that Karen and Emily would try to swoop in and take what wasn't theirs. A week after the funeral, I received a call from a local law firm. My heart raced as I answered, fearing it was Karen making good on her threat of legal action. Mrs. Thompson, a crisp, professional voice asked. This is James Anderson from Anderson and Partners. I'm calling regarding your late husband's will. I felt a glimmer of hope. His will? I didn't know he had one. Yes, ma'am. Mr. Thompson came to see us about 6 months ago. He asked that we contact you in the event of his passing. I scheduled an appointment for the next day, my mind reeling. Why hadn't Michael told me about this? What did it mean? The next morning, I wheeled Dad into Mr. Anderson's office. The lawyer greeted us warmly, his kind eyes crinkling at the corners. Mrs. Thompson, Mr. Smith, thank you for coming in, he said, gesturing for us to settle near his desk. I'm sorry for your loss. Mr. Anderson opened a file on his desk. Now, as I mentioned on the phone, your husband came to see us to draft his will. He was very clear about his wishes. I held my breath as Mr. Anderson began to read. I, Michael Thompson, being of sound mind, do hereby bequeath all my worldly possessions to my beloved wife, Chloe Thompson. I gasped. Dad's grip on my hand tightened. Mr. Anderson continued, this includes our home, my truck, and all our savings. It is my wish that Chloe use these resources to care for herself and her father, Mark Smith, whom I have come to love as my own. Tears were streaming down my face now. Even from beyond the grave, Michael was taking care of us. There's more, Mr. Anderson said gently. Mr. Thompson left a letter for you. He handed me an envelope. With shaking hands, I opened it and began to read. My dearest Chloe. If you're reading this, it means I'm gone. I'm so sorry for leaving you and Mark. Please know that you two were the best thing that ever happened to me. I made this will because I know how my mother and sister can be. I didn't want to worry you, but I needed to make sure you and Mark were protected if anything happened to me. You're my real family, Chloe. You and Mark. Not them. Take care of each other. Live your lives to the fullest. And know that I'll always be watching over you. All my love, Michael. I clutched the letter to my chest, sobbing. Dad was crying too, his weathered hand patting my arm. Mr. Anderson gave us a moment before speaking again. Mrs. Thompson, there's one more thing. Your husband's truck was insured. Given the circumstances of the accident, the insurance company will be paying out the full value of the policy. I looked up, sniffling. What does that mean? It means, Mr. Anderson said with a small smile, that you'll be receiving a substantial sum. Enough to pay off your mortgage and then some. As we left the lawyer's office, I felt like a weight had been lifted from my shoulders. We were going to be okay. Michael had made sure of it. As we pulled into our driveway, I noticed a familiar car parked on the street. My heart sank as I recognized Karen's sleek sedan. Oh no, I muttered. What now? Sure enough, Karen and Emily were waiting on our front porch. But this time, I wasn't afraid. I had Michael's letter in my pocket and the strength of his love in my heart. Chloe, Karen began as we approached, her voice sickly sweet. We need to talk about Michael's estate. I stood tall, looking her straight in the eye. No, Karen. We don't. Michael left everything to me. It's all legal and official. And do you want to know why? Because we were his real family. Not you. Now, please leave. You're trespassing on my property. For once, Karen was speechless. Emily tugged at her arm, whispering urgently. With one last venomous glare, they got in their car and drove away. The weeks following our meeting with the lawyer were a whirlwind of activity. I threw myself into settling Michael's affairs, grateful for the distraction from my grief. The insurance payout came through, and true to Mr. Anderson's word, it was enough to pay off our mortgage, with plenty left over. One afternoon, as I was going through Michael's desk, I came across a small notebook. Curious, I opened it and found pages filled with his messy scrawl. It was a journal of sorts, filled with his thoughts and plans for our future. Thinking about starting a college fund for our future kids, one entry read. Want to make sure they have the best start in life. My heart clenched. We had talked about having children someday, but had decided to wait until we were more financially stable. Now, reading Michael's private hopes and dreams, I felt a fresh wave of grief wash over me. Oh, Michael, I whispered, clutching the notebook to my chest. We had so many plans. That night, I tossed and turned, unable to sleep. My mind kept drifting to the journal, to the future we'd never have. When I finally drifted off, I dreamed of Michael. He was smiling, holding out his hand to me. It's okay, Chloe, he said in my dream. Everything's going to be all right. I woke up the next morning feeling different. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but something had changed. As I got ready for work, a wave of nausea hit me. I barely made it to the bathroom in time. But as the days went by, the morning sickness persisted. At first, I chalked it up to stress and grief. But a small voice in the back of my mind whispered another possibility. Finally, after a week of this, I found myself standing in the pharmacy aisle, staring at pregnancy tests. With trembling hands, I bought one and hurried home. The 3 minutes I waited for the result were the longest of my life. When I finally looked at the test, I saw 2 clear blue lines. I sank to the bathroom floor, a mix of emotions overwhelming me. Joy, fear, grief, hope, they all swirled together in a dizzying cocktail. Chloe? Dad's voice came through the door. Everything okay in there? I opened the door, tears streaming down my face. Dad's expression immediately changed from concern to alarm. What's wrong, sweetie? He asked. I held up the test, my hand shaking. I'm pregnant, Dad. I fell into his arms, sobbing. He held me, stroking my hair like he used to when I was a little girl. It's okay, he murmured. It's going to be okay. You're not alone, Chloe. And this baby is a gift. A piece of Michael that will live on. His words struck a chord in me. This baby was a part of Michael, a continuation of our love. Suddenly, the fear began to recede, replaced by a fierce determination. You're right, I said, wiping my eyes. This baby is a gift. And we're going to be okay. Dad smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. That's my girl. Now, let's get you something to eat. You're eating for two now, after all. As we made our way to the kitchen, I felt a sense of hope blooming in my chest. Yes, the road ahead would be challenging. But with my father by my side and Michael's child growing inside me, I knew we could face anything. As my belly grew with our child, I found strength I never knew I had. Dad was my rock, always there with a kind word or a helping hand. We settled into a new routine, just the two of us, eagerly anticipating the arrival of the newest member of our little family. One sunny afternoon, as I was tending to the garden Dad and I had planted together, I heard a car pull up. My heart sank as I recognized Karen's sedan. What could they possibly want now? I made my way to the front of the house, one hand instinctively cradling my swollen belly. Karen and Emily stood on our porch, looking uncomfortable and slightly desperate. "Chloe," Karen began, her voice lacking its usual sharpness. We need to talk to you." I raised an eyebrow but said nothing, waiting for her to continue. Emily chimed in, her eyes darting around nervously. "We've hit some hard times. We were wondering if we could stay in your father's old apartment. Just until we get back on our feet." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. After everything they'd put us through, they had the audacity to ask for more? "I'm sorry," I said, my voice firm but calm. "That's not possible. I don't want to communicate with you anymore." Karen's eyes narrowed as they fell on my pregnant belly. Her face contorted with a mix of shock and disgust. You're pregnant?" she spat. "Already? You little prostitute. I can't believe you've already found a new man. Michael's body isn't even cold in the ground." I felt a surge of anger, but I pushed it down. I didn't make excuses and say that it was Michael's child. I didn't want my baby to have such a grandmother and aunt. Instead, I smiled, a small, secretive smile that seemed to unnerve Karen even more. "My personal life is none of your concern," I said calmly. "Now, I think it's time for you to leave." Karen looked like she wanted to say more, but something in my expression must have stopped her. She turned on her heel, grabbing Emily's arm. I watched as they drove away, feeling a sense of peace wash over me. I had stood my ground, protected my family, and maintained my dignity. Michael would have been proud. My name is Nina, and I never thought I'd be telling this story. I grew up in a world of privilege, the only child of Robert and Elizabeth Collins. My father was a self-made man, having built his business empire from the ground up. He was stern but loving, always pushing me to be my best. My mother, on the other hand, was the epitome of grace and sophistication, moving through high society circles with ease. Our family lived in a sprawling mansion on the outskirts of the city. I had everything a girl could want: the best education, designer clothes, exotic vacations. But despite all the material comforts, there was always a part of me that felt empty. Enter Mark Johnson. I met him during my final year of college, and it was like a bolt of lightning struck me. He was charming, handsome, and seemed to understand me in a way no one else ever had. We started dating, and for the first time in my life, I felt truly alive. There was just one problem: my parents hated him. "Nina, darling," my mother said one evening over dinner, "don't you think Mark is attracted to you not only by your inner qualities, but also by our money?" My father chimed in, his face set in a hard frown. "He's got no prospects, no ambition. He's not the kind of man who can give you the life you're accustomed to." "I don't care about any of that," I shouted, pushing away from the table. "I love him, and he loves me. Isn't that what matters?" Things came to a head when Mark proposed. It was a simple affair, no fancy restaurant, no elaborate setup. Just the two of us, walking in the park where we had our first date. He got down on one knee, pulled out a modest ring, and asked me to be his wife. I said yes without hesitation. When I told my parents, all hell broke loose. "If you marry him, you're no longer welcome in this house," my father roared. Daddy, please, I begged, tears streaming down my face. Can't you just be happy for me? But he wouldn't budge. My mother stood silently by his side, her face a mask of disappointment. I left that night, my heart breaking but my resolve firm. I moved in with Mark, into the small apartment he shared with a roommate. It was a far cry from the luxury I was used to, but I was determined to make it work. The weeks leading up to the wedding were a blur of planning and stress. I kept hoping my parents would come around, that they'd realize how much their presence meant to me. But as the big day approached, it became clear they weren't going to change their minds. As I walked down the aisle, I scanned the faces of our guests, still holding out hope that I'd see my parents. But they weren't there. For a moment, sadness threatened to overwhelm me. Then I saw Mark, standing at the altar, looking at me like I was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. In that moment, everything else faded away. My parents' absence, the modest surroundings, the uncertain future, none of it mattered. I was marrying the man I loved, and that was enough. After the wedding, Mark and I moved into the luxury apartment in the city center that my beloved grandfather had left me. It was a stark contrast to Mark's old place, spacious, with high ceilings, and a view of the city skyline. I spent days decorating it, trying to make it feel like our home. As the days turned into weeks and then months, we settled into married life. Mark threw himself into his work at a local marketing firm, often coming home late but always with a smile and a kiss for me. I busied myself with setting up our home and volunteering at a local animal shelter. About a year and a half after our wedding, our lives changed forever. I still remember the day I found out I was pregnant. My hands were shaking as I held the positive test, a mix of excitement and terror coursing through me. When I told Mark, his face lit up like a Christmas tree. "We're going to be parents," he exclaimed, picking me up and spinning me around. "Nina, this is amazing." When our son, Jacob, was born, I was overwhelmed with love. He was perfect, 10 tiny fingers, 10 tiny toes, and a shock of dark hair, just like his father's. Through the haze of exhaustion and joy, I snapped a picture of him and sent it to my parents. I waited for a response. A call, a text, anything. But there was nothing but silence. "They'll come around," Mark assured me, seeing the hurt in my eyes. How could they resist this little guy? I tried to push the disappointment aside and focus on our new family. A few months after Jacob was born, I decided it was time for me to get back to work. I found a part-time position as a manager at a local boutique. Balancing work, a newborn, and keeping the house in order was a challenge, but I was determined to make it work. I'd wake up early to feed Jacob, drop him off at daycare, work my shift, pick him up, make dinner, clean the house, and collapse into bed, only to do it all over again the next day. But as Jacob neared his first birthday, I started to notice changes in Mark. He became more distant, often coming home even later than before. When he was home, he seemed distracted, always on his phone. "Everything okay at work?" I asked one night as we got ready for bed. "Yeah, just busy," he mumbled, not meeting my eyes. "Big project coming up." As I drifted off to sleep that night, Jacob's soft breathing coming through the baby monitor, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. But I pushed it aside. We were happy, weren't we? We had a beautiful son, a lovely home, good jobs. What more could I want? The changes in Mark became more pronounced as time went on. One evening, as I was putting Jacob to bed, Mark cornered me in the nursery. "Nina, we need to talk," he said, his tone unusually serious. "I think you should quit your job." I blinked, sure I had misheard him. "Quit my job? Why?" "Look around," he gestured vaguely. "The house is a mess. Jacob needs more attention. I think it would be better if you focused on being a full-time mom and housewife." I felt like I'd been slapped. But I love my job. And I thought we were managing just fine. Mark's face hardened. "Well, we're not. I'm the man of this house, and I'm telling you, it's time to quit." We argued late into the night, but in the end, I gave in. I told myself it was for the good of our family, that Mark was just stressed from work. The next day, with a heavy heart, I handed in my resignation. At first, I threw myself into my new role with gusto. I deep cleaned the apartment, tried new recipes, and spent hours playing with Jacob. But as the days wore on, I found myself missing the structure and satisfaction of my job. Meanwhile, Mark's behavior continued to change. He started coming home later and later, often smelling of alcohol. Our bank account, which I had access to, showed mysterious withdrawals. One night, as I was folding laundry, I confronted him. "Mark, where is all our money going? We're barely making ends meet." He exploded. "Maybe if you knew how to budget properly, we wouldn't have this problem." I recoiled, shocked at his outburst. This wasn't the man I married. Things only got worse from there. Mark began criticizing everything I did. The house was never clean enough, dinner was never good enough, I wasn't attentive enough to Jacob. The final straw came when Jacob got sick with a nasty flu. He was running a high fever and crying constantly. I was at my wit's end, having been up for 2 nights straight. "Mark, please," I begged. "Can you take a day off work to help me with Jacob? I'm exhausted." He looked at me like I was crazy. "Take a day off? Are you kidding? Some of us actually have to work for a living, Nina." The next day, he came home with a suitcase. "I'm going to a hotel for a few days," he announced. "I need to rest after work, not listen to a screaming kid." I was stunned. "You're leaving us? Now?" He shrugged, already heading for the door. "Taking care of Jacob is your job, not mine. Call me when he's better." As the door slammed behind him, I sank to the floor, Jacob wailing in my arms. What had happened to us? To the man who had once looked at me like I hung the moon? In that moment, I missed my parents more than ever. I wanted to call them, to hear my mother's soothing voice, to feel my father's protective embrace. But pride and shame held me back. How could I admit that they had been right all along? As I rocked Jacob, trying to soothe both his cries and my own, I couldn't help but think about the words my father had said on the day I told them about my engagement. "He's not the man you think he is, Nina." The days following Mark's departure to the hotel were a blur of sleepless nights and exhausting days. Jacob's fever finally broke, and as his health improved, I found myself with more time to think, perhaps too much time. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong in my marriage. The man who had returned from the hotel was not the Mark I had fallen in love with. He was distant, irritable, and seemed to resent both Jacob and me. One evening, about a week after he'd returned, Mark came home earlier than usual. His face was serious, and he was clutching some papers. "Nina, we need to talk about insurance," he said, sitting down at the kitchen table. "I've taken out a life insurance policy on myself for $1 million. I think you should do the same." The amount made my head spin. $1 million? Mark, that seems excessive. And why do I need such a large policy? I don't even work outside the home anymore. His eyes hardened. "It's for Jacob's future. In case anything happens to either of us. Don't you want to make sure he's taken care of?" Put that way, I couldn't argue. Still, something about the whole situation felt off. "I suppose you're right," I said slowly. "If you think it's best." He nodded, seemingly satisfied. "I'll set up the appointment with the insurance agent." Over the next few days, I noticed Mark's behavior becoming even stranger. He was constantly on his phone, texting at all hours. Whenever it rang, he'd leave the room to answer, often locking himself in our home office. One morning, after Mark left for work, I made a decision. I couldn't live with this uncertainty anymore. I needed answers. With shaking hands, I picked up my phone and dialed a number I'd found online. "Hawkeye Private Investigations, how can I help you?" a gruff voice answered. I took a deep breath. I need someone to follow my husband. I think he might be. I couldn't bring myself to say the words, but the investigator seemed to understand. "I see, ma'am. Why don't you come into our office and we can discuss the details? That afternoon, while Jacob was napping, I met with the investigator, a no-nonsense woman named Linda. I told her everything, the late nights, the secret of phone calls, the drastic personality change. Linda listened intently, taking notes. We'll get to the bottom of this, Mrs. Johnson. I'll have my best guy on it. As I left her office, I felt a mix of relief and dread. Part of me hoped this was all a misunderstanding, that there was a reasonable explanation for Mark's behavior. But a larger part knew that whatever the investigator uncovered was likely to change my life forever. 3 weeks after hiring the private investigator, I received the call I had been both dreading and anticipating. Mrs. Johnson, we have the report ready, Linda's voice came through the phone. You might want to sit down for this. With trembling hands, I sank into a chair, my heart pounding. I'm ready. Tell me everything. As Linda spoke, I felt my world crumbling around me. Mark, my husband, the father of my child, had been unfaithful. He had a mistress. The evidence was irrefutable: photographs, text messages, hotel receipts. It was all there in black and white. I waited until Mark left for work the next morning before springing into action. With shaking hands, I packed a bag for myself and Jacob, throwing in only the essentials. Clothes, diapers, a few of Jacob's favorite toys. I couldn't bear to look at the photos on the walls, the happy memories that now felt like lies. We're going to see Grandma and Grandpa, I cooed to Jacob as I put him in the stroller. He giggled, oblivious to the turmoil around him. I decided to take the metro to my parents' house. It would be faster than driving through rush hour traffic. As I approached the station, my mind was racing, planning our next steps. That's when it happened. I was crossing the street, pushing Jacob in his stroller, when suddenly there was a screech of tires. I turned my head and saw a car hurtling towards us. In a split second, I pushed the stroller out of the way. Then, pain. Blinding, all-consuming pain. And then, darkness. I don't know how long I was unconscious. When I finally opened my eyes, I was in a hospital room. The steady beep of machines filled the air. And there, sitting by my bed, looking haggard and worried, was Mark. Jacob, I croaked, my throat dry. Where's Jacob? Mark leaned forward, taking my hand. He's fine, Nina. He's with Lisa, your best friend. Not a scratch on him. Relief flooded through me, quickly followed by a wave of pain. I looked down at my legs, both encased in casts. You have multiple fractures in both legs, Mark explained gently. The doctors say it'll take about a year for you to fully recover. You'll need to use a wheelchair for a while. I closed my eyes, trying to process this information. A year. A wheelchair. And then, like a bolt of lightning, I remembered why I had been at that metro station in the first place. I know about her, I blurted out, my eyes snapping open to gauge Mark's reaction. Your mistress. I know everything. Mark's face paled. For a moment, he looked like he might deny it. Then his shoulders slumped. Nina, it wasn't serious. It was a stupid mistake, he stammered. When I got the call about your accident, I realized how close I came to losing you. I can't lose you, Nina. Please, can we start over? Give me another chance. I'll do better, I promise. I looked at him, this man I had loved for so long. He seemed so sincere, so remorseful. And I was so tired, so overwhelmed by everything that had happened. Okay, I heard myself say. We can try. The day I was discharged from the hospital was surreal. Mark arrived with a bouquet of my favorite flowers, pink peonies. His smile seemed genuine, his eyes filled with concern and love. As he wheeled me out of the hospital, I felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe we could make this work after all. The first 2 weeks at home were surprisingly nice. Mark was attentive, caring, almost doting. He helped me with everything, from getting dressed to bathing. He'd carry me to the bathroom in his arms, careful not to jostle my injured legs. It reminded me of our early days together, when every touch felt electric. One evening, as we sat on the couch watching a movie, Mark turned to me with a glint in his eye. "Nina, I've been thinking," he said, taking my hand. "We should get away for a weekend. Just the two of us. To celebrate your recovery and, well, us." My heart skipped a beat. "Really? Where?" "I found this cozy little house in the mountains, overlooking a beautiful canyon." "What do you say?" I couldn't help but smile. "That sounds wonderful. But what about Jacob? And I'm in a wheelchair. I'm sure Lisa wouldn't mind watching him for a couple of days." "About the wheelchair. If anything, I'll carry you in my arms. Come on, it'll be good for us." I agreed, feeling a mixture of excitement and nervousness. This could be exactly what we needed to reconnect. The drive to the mountains was peaceful. As we wound our way up the narrow road, I felt the tension of the past months slowly melting away. The house, when we arrived, was everything Mark had promised: cozy, secluded, with breathtaking views of the canyon. "I'm going to explore a bit," Mark said after we'd settled in. "Why don't you rest?" I nodded, watching him disappear down a trail. Left alone, I decided to check my emails. I hadn't had a chance to do so since the accident. My phone was nowhere to be found, so I wheeled myself over to Mark's laptop. As I opened the browser, an email notification popped up. It was from an unfamiliar address, but the subject line made my blood run cold. "Urgent, new information about your case." With trembling hands, I clicked on it. The message was from Linda, the private investigator I'd hired weeks ago. My heart pounded as I read. "Mrs. Johnson, I've been trying to reach you. Your number is out of service. I've uncovered disturbing new information. You're in danger. Your husband was involved in your accident. He's trying to get rid of you for the insurance money and your apartment. His mistress was driving the car that hit you. I've attached evidence, photos, videos, texts. Please contact me immediately." I stared at the screen, my mind reeling. There was Mark, plotting with his mistress. There were bank statements showing large withdrawals. There was a grainy video of a woman who looked remarkably like Mark's assistant behind the wheel of a car, moments before impact. Just as I closed the laptop, Mark walked in. I tried to compose myself, but my heart was racing. "Everything okay, Nina?" he asked, his voice deceptively casual. I forced a smile. "Yeah, I can't find my phone." "Have you seen it?" A cold smile played on Mark's lips. "Oh, that. It broke down suddenly. Must have been damaged in the accident." A chill ran down my spine. I needed to contact someone, anyone, but how? "Mark," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Could I borrow your phone? I want to check on Jacob, see how he's doing with Lisa." He hesitated for a moment, then handed me his phone. "Sure, go ahead. I'll just be right here." My hands trembled as I took the phone. Mark hovered nearby, watching. I knew I couldn't call the police or even Lisa. Then, a memory flashed in my mind, a conversation with my father years ago. "If you're ever in trouble and can't speak freely, ask about Buddy the bear. I'll know you need help." Praying my father hadn't changed his number, I dialed. When he answered, I put on my brightest voice. "Hey, Lisa. How's everything going? How's Buddy the bear doing?" There was a pause, and I held my breath. Then my father's voice came through, deliberately high-pitched to sound feminine. "Oh, you know, same old, same old. How are you?" Relief washed over me. He understood. "Oh, it's lovely up here," I gushed, aware of Mark's eyes on me. "We're at this beautiful cabin, 1247 Pine Ridge Road. The view of Evergreen Canyon is just stunning." "I see," my father said carefully. "When do you think you'll be back?" "Oh, I dream of seeing you right now, this very second," I said emphatically. "I miss you guys already." After exchanging a few more pleasantries, I hung up. Mark seemed satisfied, not suspecting anything amiss. As evening approached, Mark suggested a walk. The sunset over the canyon is beautiful. We shouldn't miss it. Fear gripped me, but I knew I had no choice. That sounds nice, I managed to say. Mark wheeled me out onto a narrow path that wound along the edge of the canyon. The view was breathtaking. The setting sun painted the sky in brilliant hues of orange and purple, the canyon stretching endlessly before us, but all I could think about was the sheer drop just feet away. As Mark pushed my wheelchair, chatting about the scenery as if everything was normal, I closed my eyes and prayed. Please, Dad, I thought desperately. Please find me in time. The path curved one last time, and suddenly we were at the edge of the cliff. Mark turned my chair around, and our eyes met. The loving facade he'd maintained crumbled away, revealing a stranger with eyes full of anger and hatred. You know, Nina, he said, his voice cold and detached. I'm really sorry it had to come to this. The car accident was supposed to take care of everything, but you just had to survive, didn't you? My blood ran cold as the full truth of my situation hit me. Mark, please, I whispered, don't do this. He laughed mirthlessly. Do you have any idea how perfect this is? A tragic accident at a scenic overlook. Your wheelchair rolls off the edge when the brakes fail. I'll be the grieving widower, inherit your apartment, and cash in that $1 million insurance policy. It's foolproof. As he spoke, he inched my wheelchair closer to the edge. I closed my eyes, silently praying for a miracle. Suddenly, I heard shouts and running footsteps. My eyes flew open to see my father sprinting down the path, followed closely by several police officers. Nina, my father yelled, reaching us just as Mark was about to push me over. He grabbed the handles of my wheelchair, yanking me back from the brink. Everything happened in a blur after that. The police tackled Mark to the ground, reading him his rights as they handcuffed him. I sat there, shaking, as the reality of what had almost happened washed over me. My father knelt beside my wheelchair, pulling me into a tight embrace. I broke down, sobbing into his shoulder. I'm so sorry, Dad, I choked out between sobs. You were right about him. I should have listened to you. He stroked my hair gently, his own voice thick with emotion. No, sweetheart. I'm the one who should be sorry. We let our pride keep us apart. Can you forgive us for not being there for you and Jacob? I nodded, unable to speak through my tears. We stayed like that for a long moment, years of hurt and misunderstanding melting away. In the weeks that followed, everything changed. I filed for divorce, and with the overwhelming evidence against him, Mark was sentenced to prison for attempted murder, along with his mistress who had driven the car in the original accident. I sold the apartment that held so many painful memories and bought a new one, close to a good school for Jacob and just a few blocks from my parents' house. I moved back in with my parents during my rehabilitation. It was a year of healing, both physically and emotionally. My parents doted on Jacob, making up for lost time with their grandson. Slowly, I learned to trust again, to smile again, to hope again. My name is Veronica, and at 59, I thought I had it all figured out. A successful career, a thriving business, and a marriage that had weathered 3 decades. I met Robert when I was 27. He was a brilliant plastic surgeon with dreams of opening his own clinic. I was a business graduate with a knack for management. We clicked instantly, our ambitions aligning perfectly. Within a year, we were married and working towards our shared goal. Over the next few years, we poured our hearts and souls into establishing our clinic. It wasn't easy, but we made it work. Robert's skill as a surgeon and my business acumen proved to be a winning combination. Slowly but surely, our reputation grew. There was only one cloud on our horizon: children. Or rather, the lack of them. After 2 years of trying, we discovered Robert had fertility issues. The news hit him hard. "I'm sorry, Veronica," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know how much you wanted kids." I hugged him tight. It's okay, Robert. We have each other, and we have our clinic. That's enough. But was it? There were times when I'd see mothers with their children and feel a pang of regret. I pushed those feelings aside, focusing instead on our growing business. As the years passed, our clinic became one of the most respected in the city. Then, about 6 months ago, I noticed something was off with Robert. His hands, those skilled hands that had transformed countless lives, were starting to shake. "Robert," I said one evening as we were going over some paperwork, "I think you should see a doctor." He brushed me off. "It's just fatigue, Veronica. Nothing a good night's sleep won't fix." But it wasn't just fatigue. The tremors were becoming more frequent, more noticeable. I urged him to get checked out, to consider stepping back from surgeries and focus on administrative work. He wouldn't hear of it. Despite my concerns about Robert's health, we continued to push forward with our plans for the clinic. We needed to upgrade our equipment, expand our services. It would require a significant investment, more than we could manage on our own. That's when I started reaching out to potential investors. It was a long process, filled with meetings, presentations, and negotiations. But finally, after months of work, we had a deal. The day the funds hit our account, I felt a surge of triumph. This was it, the next big step for our clinic. I decided to surprise Robert with the news over lunch. I ordered his favorites from that little Italian place down the street and set everything up in my office. The door opened, and Robert walked in. He looked tired, but his eyes lit up when he saw the spread. "What's all this?" he asked, a smile playing on his lips. I grinned back. "I have some news. The investors came through. The money's in our account. We can order that new equipment we'd been eyeing." For a moment, Robert's face lit up with the boyish enthusiasm I'd fallen in love with all those years ago. He swept me into a hug, laughing. "That's fantastic, Veronica. You're amazing, you know that?" I basked in his praise, feeling like we were back on solid ground. Then he pulled back, a mischievous glint in his eye. "I have a surprise for you too," he said. "I want you to meet someone." I raised an eyebrow, curiosity piqued. "Oh, a new client?" He shook his head, a strange smile playing on his lips. "Not exactly. She's our new nurse." Before I could process this information, the door swung open, and in walked a young woman. She couldn't have been more than 22, with long blonde hair, pouty lips, and a figure that screamed recent work done. She flashed a dazzling smile at Robert before turning her gaze to me. "Hi, I'm Ella," she chirped, her voice syrupy sweet. "It's so nice to meet you, Mrs. Henderson." I blinked, taken aback. "I'm sorry, but I don't recall us hiring a new nurse. Especially one so young." Robert cleared his throat. "Well, that's the surprise. Ella here is eager to join our team. She's just completed her nursing courses." "Courses?" I echoed, my eyes narrowing. "Not a full nursing degree?" Ella's smile faltered slightly. "Well, not yet. But I'm a quick learner. And Dr. Henderson says he'll teach me everything I need to know." I turned to Robert, disbelief etched on my face. "Can I speak with you privately for a moment?" We stepped out into the hallway, leaving Ella in my office. As soon as the door closed, I rounded on Robert. "What the hell are you thinking?" I hissed. "We can't hire someone with no experience, especially not in a medical setting." Robert had the decency to look sheepish. "Look, I know it's unorthodox, but Ella is bright and eager to learn. She was a patient of mine, breast augmentation, and she was so impressed with our work that she wanted to be part of it." I felt my blood pressure rising. "Robert, this is a professional medical facility, not a fan club. We can't just hire someone because they like their boob job." His face hardened. "Keep your voice down. I've made my decision. Ella starts next week." I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. "If you hire her, I won't work with her. It's me or her, Robert." I expected him to back down, to realize how ridiculous this whole situation was. Instead, his next words hit me like a slap in the face. "Then I guess you should pack your things, Veronica." For a moment, I couldn't breathe. 32 years of marriage, of building a life and a business together, and he was choosing this girl over me? Without another word, I turned and walked back into my office. Ella was still there, examining her reflection in the window. "Well," I said, my voice tight. "It seems congratulations are in order. The job is yours." I grabbed my purse and coat. As I walked out of the clinic, I could feel their eyes on me, Robert's conflicted, Ella's triumphant. I held my head high, refusing to let them see how shaken I was. The days following my confrontation with Robert at the clinic dragged on endlessly. Surely, I thought, Robert would come to his senses. He'd realize he needed me, not just as his wife, but as the backbone of our business. But a week passed, and still no word from Robert. I was beginning to wonder if I should reach out again when my phone rang. It was Sarah, an old friend who frequented the same social circles as Robert and me. "Veronica? It's Sarah. I'm not sure how to say this, but do you know your husband is getting married?" The world seemed to tilt on its axis. "What? Sarah, what are you talking about?" Sarah's voice was hesitant, laden with discomfort. "I saw Robert yesterday. He was at Bella's bridal with a young woman. They were choosing a wedding dress." The conversation that followed was a blur. I thanked Sarah mechanically and hung up, my mind reeling. Without thinking, I grabbed my car keys and headed for the clinic. I marched straight to Robert's office, not bothering to knock. He looked up as I entered, a smug smile playing on his lips. "Veronica, I suppose we should discuss the details. Ella and I are getting married. She's pregnant." The words hit me like a physical blow. I sank into the chair opposite him, struggling to breathe. "Pregnant? But, how? You're..." "Not anymore, apparently," he said with a chuckle. "Ella's been giving me some special supplements. Seems they've done the trick." I stared at him, this stranger wearing my husband's face. In that moment, I realized that the man I'd loved for over 3 decades was gone. This person before me was someone else entirely. "I've had my lawyer draw up the divorce papers," Robert continued, sliding a folder across the desk. "I think you'll find the terms quite generous." Numbly, I opened the folder and scanned the documents. Despite the turmoil in my heart, my business mind kicked in, analyzing the terms. He was offering me our house, the apartment we rented out, substantial financial compensation, and alimony. In exchange, he would retain full ownership of the clinic and our other business assets. With a steady hand that belied my inner turmoil, I signed the papers. As I stood to leave, a final concern nagged at me. "Robert, your health. The tremors in your hands. You really should see a doctor. Maybe consider stepping back from surgeries for a while." He laughed, the sound grating on my nerves. "Oh, Veronica. Always the worrier. I'm fine. I feel young again, successful. Unlike some of us who are clearly ready for retirement." The days following the divorce settlement stretched out before me like an endless, empty road. For the first time in decades, I found myself without purpose, without a job to pour my energy into. The silence of my house was deafening. Initially, I tried to fill the void by visiting friends. But as I sat in their living rooms, nursing cups of tea that had long gone cold, I realized my mistake. These were our friends, mine and Robert's. Every conversation inevitably circled back to the upcoming wedding. I heard the bride's dress is being flown in from Paris. "Can you imagine?" one would say, voice hushed as if imparting a great secret. Then would come the sympathetic looks, the gentle pats on my hand. "Oh, but how are you holding up, dear? It must be so difficult." Their words, meant to comfort, felt like sandpaper against my raw emotions. The pitying smiles, the understanding nods, it was all too much. Gradually, I began to withdraw, declining invitations and screening calls. Alone in the house that now felt too big for just me, I found myself wandering from room to room, touching familiar objects that now seemed to belong to another life. In the study, my eyes fell on an old easel tucked away in the corner, gathering dust. Painting. I used to love it, before the clinic consumed all my time and energy. On a whim, I pulled out the easel, found some old canvases and paints, and set up by the large bay window in the living room. 2 months slipped by in this fashion. I was by no means healed, but I was coping. Then came the call that would change everything once again. "Ms. Henderson? This is Dr. Emily Chen from Radiant Transformations Clinic. I hope I'm not disturbing you." I recognized the name. Radiant Transformations was Robert's main competitor in the city. "Not at all, Dr. Chen. How can I help you?" There was a slight pause. "Well, Ms. Henderson, we've heard some rumors. Is it true that you're no longer working at Henderson Plastic Surgery? And that you and Dr. Henderson have separated?" I took a deep breath. "Yes, that's correct. We're divorced, actually." "I see." Dr. Chen's voice was carefully neutral. "In that case, Ms. Henderson, I have a proposition for you. We've always admired your work in practice management. Would you be interested in joining our team here at Radiant Transformations?" The offer took me by surprise. For a moment, I was speechless. Then, a slow smile spread across my face. "I would be very interested, Dr. Chen. When would you like to meet to discuss details?" The following weeks were a whirlwind of activity. Meetings, paperwork, getting to know my new team. For the first time in months, I felt alive again, energized. It was during this busy period that I happened to catch a news segment one evening. There, splashed across my TV screen, were photos of Robert and Ella, sun-kissed and smiling on a beach in the Maldives. The ticker at the bottom of the screen proclaimed, "Local plastic surgeon weds in lavish Maldives ceremony." I expected the sight to hurt, to reopen wounds that had barely begun to heal. Instead, I felt nothing. No pain, no anger, not even resentment. Just a vague sense of pity for the man who had thrown away decades of partnership for a fleeting infatuation. A month had passed. Life at Radiant Transformations was going well, and I was finally starting to feel like myself again. Then, on an otherwise ordinary Tuesday afternoon, my phone rang. The number was unfamiliar. "Is this Veronica?" A young, slightly shrill voice came through the speaker. It took me a moment to place it. "Ella?" I said, disbelief coloring my tone. "What do you want?" "It's Robert," she said, her voice trembling. "He's in trouble. A surgery went wrong. A facelift for some big shot's wife. Her face, it's all messed up. Her husband is threatening to sue us, to ruin the clinic. You have to come and fix this." The audacity of her request left me momentarily speechless. When I found my voice, it was cold and firm. "I don't have to do anything, Ella. I don't work there anymore, remember? But you always handled this stuff," she whined. "Robert needs you." I took a deep breath, tamping down my anger. I warned Robert about his tremors. I told him to see a doctor, to stop performing surgeries. It was clear he was developing symptoms of Parkinson's disease. But he wouldn't listen. "Parkinson's?" Ella scoffed. "Don't be ridiculous. You're just a jealous old woman who can't stand to see Robert happy and successful." The line went dead before I could respond. I stared at the phone, a mixture of emotions swirling within me. Concern for the patient, anger at Ella's words, and a grim satisfaction at being proven right about Robert's condition. Shaking my head, I turned back to my work. Whatever mess Robert had gotten himself into, it wasn't my problem anymore. A week later, my phone rang again. This time, it was a number I recognized all too well. "Veronica?" Robert's voice sounded strained, desperate. "I need your help." I remained silent, waiting for him to continue. "It's the clinic reports," he said. "I can't make sense of them. You've always handled this stuff. Could you come in and take a look?" part of me wanted to refuse outright, to tell him that his problems were no longer my concern. But another part, the part that had built that clinic from the ground up, couldn't bear the thought of it falling apart. "Fine," I said curtly. "I'll be there in an hour." Robert looked haggard, with dark circles under his eyes and a pallor to his skin that spoke of sleepless nights. But what caught my attention were his hands, trembling visibly as he shuffled papers on his desk. As I pored over the documents, a grim picture began to emerge. The clinic's finances were in disarray. But more alarmingly, there was a glaring discrepancy in the accounts. "Robert," I said slowly, looking up at him. "What happened to the money from the investors? The funds for the new equipment?" He wouldn't meet my eyes. I had to use it for other things." "Other things?" I pressed, my voice hardening. "Like your wedding? My divorce settlement?" Robert's face crumpled. "I thought I could make it back quickly. If I just did a few more high-profile surgeries." "Like the one that went wrong?" I said, the pieces falling into place. "Robert, this is serious. This is misuse of funds. The investors could sue you for this." "I know," he exploded, his trembling hands sending papers flying. "And now with this botched surgery. Veronica, I'm ruined. They're going to take everything." As I stood there, reports in hand, the office door swung open. Ella sauntered in, her face a mask of haughty disdain that faltered slightly when she saw me. My eyes instinctively dropped to her midsection, and I frowned. "Weren't you supposed to be pregnant?" I asked, unable to keep the skepticism from my voice. "You're not showing at all for someone who should be, 4 months along now?" Ella's cheeks flushed, and she unconsciously placed a hand over her flat stomach. It's just not visible yet," she stammered unconvincingly. Ignoring her weak excuse, I turned to Robert. "What exactly were those fertility treatments you mentioned? The ones that miraculously cured your infertility?" Robert, looking increasingly uncomfortable, gestured vaguely towards Ella. "She's been giving them to me. Some kind of herbal supplement, I think." I raised an eyebrow at Ella. "Well, care to enlighten us?" Reluctantly, Ella reached into her designer purse and pulled out a small pill bottle. She handed it to me, avoiding eye contact. As soon as I read the label, I couldn't help but laugh. "Robert," I said, shaking my head, "these aren't fertility drugs. They're just run-of-the-mill erectile dysfunction pills. They don't have any effect on actual fertility." Robert's face paled, his eyes darting between me and Ella. But she said. "She lied," I said flatly. Then, a more serious thought occurred to me. "Robert, you shouldn't be taking these, especially not with your condition. They can exacerbate the symptoms of Parkinson's disease. They might even be speeding up its progression." The color drained from Robert's face as the implications of my words sank in. He opened his mouth, likely to berate Ella, when his phone rang. The caller ID showed it was his lawyer. Robert answered, his voice shaky. "Hello? Yes, this is Dr. Henderson." As he listened, I watched the last vestiges of color leave his face. His free hand, already trembling, began to shake so violently that he had to set it on the desk to steady it. I see," he said weakly. "Yes, I understand. Thank you for letting me know." He ended the call and sat there, staring blankly at the phone in his hand. "Robert?" I prompted after a moment of heavy silence. "What is it?" He looked up at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and desperation that I'd never seen before. "It's the investors," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "They want to conduct a full audit of the clinic. They're specifically interested in how their funds for the new equipment were spent." The silence that followed the lawyer's call was deafening. I could almost hear the gears turning in Robert's head as he desperately searched for a way out of this mess. Suddenly, he looked up at me, his eyes wild with desperation. "Veronica," he said, his voice trembling, "I need your help. The house, or the apartment, could you sign them over to me?" I could sell them, pay back the investors, and save the clinic. I stared at him, incredulous. Are you serious, Robert? You want me to give you the only things I have left after our divorce? Please, he begged, his facade of confidence completely shattered. If you don't help me, I'll lose everything. The clinic, my reputation. I'll have nothing left. I felt a surge of anger rising within me. And whose fault is that, Robert? You're the one who cheated. You're the one who threw away 32 years of marriage for a pretty young thing who batted her eyelashes at you. You made your bed, now lie in it. Ella, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, suddenly piped up. Wait a minute, she said, her eyes narrowing as she looked at Robert. Are you saying you're broke? That there's no money left? Robert turned to her, desperation evident in every line of his face. It's just temporary, sweetheart. We'll get through this together, raise our baby. Ella's laugh cut through his words like a knife. It was a cold, contemptuous sound that made even me flinch. Baby, she sneered. There is no baby, you fool. I made it all up. I thought you were loaded, that I'd be set for life. But you're just a washed-up old man who can't even keep his own clinic afloat. Robert staggered back as if he'd been physically struck. But you said. I lied, Ella said bluntly. And now, I want a divorce. I'll be taking half of everything, including this precious clinic of yours. I couldn't help it, I laughed. Both Robert and Ella turned to look at me, shocked by my outburst. Oh, honey, I said, shaking my head at Ella. The only thing you two will be sharing is debt and legal fees. There's nothing left to take. Robert slumped into his chair, looking utterly defeated. Ella's face contorted with rage as the reality of the situation sank in. I'd seen enough. Without another word, I gathered my things and headed for the door. Behind me, I could hear Ella's shrill voice rising in anger, Robert's pleading responses, but I didn't look back. As I walked to my car, my phone buzzed with a message from Dr. Chen at Radiant Transformations. There was a new project she wanted my input on, something that could potentially revolutionize our approach to patient care. Weeks passed, and I threw myself into my work at Radiant Transformations. The new project was challenging and rewarding, allowing me to apply my years of experience in innovative ways. I was so engrossed in my new life that I barely thought about Robert or the old clinic anymore. Then one evening, as I was unwinding with a glass of wine and the evening news, a familiar name caught my attention. The renowned plastic surgeon Dr. Robert Henderson has been sued for medical negligence and deliberate concealment of illness, the anchor announced. I sat up straighter, my wine forgotten as I listened intently. The story unfolded like a tragic play. Robert had been forced to pay substantial financial compensation to the patient whose facelift he had botched. Worse still, the medical board had revoked his license to practice, citing his failure to disclose his Parkinson's diagnosis as a grave breach of professional ethics. As the days went by, more news trickled in. The once prestigious Henderson Plastic Surgery Clinic was hemorrhaging clients. Its reputation, built over decades of hard work, was in tatters. Then came the final blow. The investors, upon discovering the misuse of their funds, sued the clinic. Robert, drowning in debt and legal troubles, had no choice but to sell the clinic to pay off his debts and settle the claims against him. I felt a complex mix of emotions, sadness for the downfall of something I had helped build, anger at Robert's recklessness, and a strange sense of vindication. But mostly, I felt relief that I was no longer entangled in that mess. A few days later, Dr. Chen called me into her office. Her expression was unreadable as I took a seat across from her. Veronica, she began. I have some news that might interest you. Radiant Transformations has just acquired a new property. I raised an eyebrow, curious. Oh? She smiled. We've purchased the Henderson Plastic Surgery Clinic. For a moment, I was speechless. Of all the potential buyers, I never imagined it would be Radiant Transformations. I see, I managed to say. That's unexpected. Dr. Chen leaned forward, her eyes twinkling. Here's the thing, Veronica. We need someone to manage this new acquisition. Someone who knows the ins and outs of the place, who can turn it around and restore its reputation. Someone like you. I blinked, taken aback. Me? But You built that clinic from the ground up, Dr. Chen said softly. Who better to breathe new life into it? As her words sank in, I felt a surge of emotions. Fear, excitement, nostalgia, determination, they all swirled within me. But above all, I felt a sense of coming full circle. I'd be honored, I heard myself say. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of activity. Walking back into the clinic that had been my second home for so many years was surreal. There were new challenges, of course, rebuilding the clinic's reputation, reassuring old clients, and integrating with Radiant transformation systems. But with each passing day, I felt more and more in my element. One evening, as I was locking up the clinic, I paused to look at the new sign above the door. Radiant Transformations at Henderson, it read. A perfect blend of old and new, just like me. As I drove home, I couldn't help but marvel at the twists and turns my life had taken. A year ago, I had been cast aside, feeling lost and betrayed. Now, I was back where I belonged, stronger and wiser for the experience. My phone buzzed with a message from a friend, inviting me to join a group for a painting class over the weekend. I smiled, realizing I now had the time and freedom to pursue such pleasures. Life wasn't perfect, but it was good. I was happy, truly happy, for the first time in a long while. As I pulled into my driveway, I felt a deep sense of contentment wash over me. I'm Natalie, and at 35, I thought I had my life figured out. As an interior designer, I poured my heart and soul into transforming spaces. My small apartment was my sanctuary, a place where I could retreat from the world and just be myself. Losing my parents early on wasn't easy, but it taught me to be self-reliant. I got used to the quiet evenings, the solitude that comes with being alone. Don't get me wrong, I wasn't some hermit hiding from the world. I had friends, colleagues, and a career I loved. But serious relationships? They weren't on my radar. One evening, after a particularly grueling day at work, I flopped onto my couch and started scrolling through my social media. It was a mindless habit, one that helped me unwind. That's when I saw the message. Hey there, Natalie. Your designs are incredible. Have you ever thought about doing commercial spaces? I paused, my thumb hovering over the screen. The profile picture showed a handsome guy with a warm smile. Jake Thompson, 38, business owner. I hesitated for a moment before replying. Thanks, Jake. I've done a few commercial projects, but I mostly focus on residential spaces. Why do you ask? And just like that, we started chatting. At first, it was all business. He owned a small transportation company and was thinking about revamping his office. But as the days went by, our conversations drifted to other topics. Movies, books, our favorite spots in the city. It was easy, effortless. A week into our chats, Jake threw me a curveball. Natalie, I've really enjoyed talking to you. Would you like to grab coffee sometime? No pressure, just thought it'd be nice to meet in person. I stared at the message, my heart doing a little flip. Sure, why not? There's a great little cafe near my office. How about Saturday at 2? Saturday rolled around, and I found myself standing in front of my closet, suddenly aware of how much of my wardrobe consisted of work clothes. I settled on a casual sundress, something that said I made an effort, but I'm not trying too hard. The cafe was buzzing when I arrived. I scanned the room, my eyes landing on Jake. He was even more handsome in person, with kind eyes and an easy smile. He stood up when he saw me, waving me over. Natalie, it's great to finally meet you, he said, his voice warm and genuine. Likewise, I replied, sliding into the seat across from him. I hope you haven't been waiting long. And just like that, we fell into conversation. Jake was attentive, asking thoughtful questions about my work. He told me about his transportation company, the challenges of managing a fleet of trucks and drivers. Time flew by, and before I knew it, we'd been talking for hours. As we left the cafe, Jake turned to me. "I had a great time, Natalie. Would you like to do this again sometime?" I found myself nodding before I even realized it. "Yeah, I'd like that." Over the next few weeks, Jake and I started seeing each other regularly. Our coffee dates turned into dinners, and soon we were spending most of our free time together. There was something about Jake that made me feel at ease. He was confident without being arrogant, smart without being condescending. As the months passed, our relationship deepened. Jake introduced me to his mother, Sarah, a kind woman in her 60s who had recently suffered a stroke. She lived with Jake in a modest house on the outskirts of town. "Mom, this is Natalie," Jake said, his arm around my waist. Sarah's face lit up. "Oh, Jake's told me so much about you. Come in, come in." Despite her condition, Sarah was warm and welcoming. We spent the afternoon chatting, and I found myself growing fond of her. It was clear that Jake was devoted to his mother, and seeing this softer side of him made me fall for him even more. As we were leaving, Sarah pulled me aside. "You're good for him, Natalie. I haven't seen Jake this happy in years." Her words stayed with me, warming my heart. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was part of something bigger than myself. Our relationship wasn't without its challenges. Jake's work often kept him busy, and there were times when I felt like I was competing with his company for attention. But he always made time for me, surprising me with lunch dates or leaving sweet notes in my apartment. A year flew by in a whirlwind of love and laughter. On our anniversary, Jake took me to the same cafe where we had our first date. As we finished our meal, he reached across the table and took my hand. "Natalie," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "This past year has been the best of my life. You brought so much joy and love into my world. I can't imagine my life without you." My breath caught in my throat as he got down on one knee, pulling out a small velvet box. "Will you marry me?" Tears welled up in my eyes as I nodded, unable to speak. Jake slipped the ring onto my finger, and the cafe erupted in applause. As we left, hand in hand, I couldn't stop staring at the ring. It was beautiful, but more than that, it represented a future I never thought I'd have. We decided to have a small wedding, just close friends and family. Sarah was overjoyed, insisting on helping with the planning, despite her health issues. The day of the wedding was perfect. As I walked down the aisle, seeing Jake's face light up, I knew I had made the right decision. We exchanged vows, promising to love and support each other through whatever life threw our way. At the reception, Sarah pulled me aside, her eyes glistening with tears. "Welcome to the family, dear," she said, hugging me tightly. After the wedding, Jake and I decided to move into Sarah's house. It made sense, she needed care, and the house was spacious enough for all of us. I rented out my apartment, packing up my life into cardboard boxes, with a mixture of excitement and trepidation. The first few months of marriage were blissful. Jake was attentive and loving, always ready with a kiss or a kind word. Sarah and I grew closer, bonding over our shared love of gardening and cooking. It felt like I had gained not just a husband, but a mother as well. Determined to help Sarah recover from her stroke, I hired a massage therapist and a therapeutic gymnastics coach. The improvements were slow, but steady. Within a few months, Sarah was walking normally, even starting to putter around in the garden and cook meals. As for Jake and me, we were in no rush to have children. We both wanted to focus on our careers and enjoy our time together. But as our first wedding anniversary approached, I noticed a subtle shift in Jake's behavior. He started staying late at work more often, citing issues with drivers or last-minute client requests. At first, I didn't think much of it. After all, running a business wasn't easy, and I often worked late hours myself. One Saturday morning, as I was enjoying my coffee and a good book, Jake announced he had to go into the office. "On a weekend?" I asked, surprised. He shrugged, not meeting my eyes. Yeah, some paperwork I need to catch up on. Don't wait up for me, okay? As he left, I felt a twinge of unease. But I pushed it aside, focusing instead on my plans for the day. It was Sarah who first voiced her concerns. We were in the kitchen, preparing dinner, when she broached the subject. Natalie, dear, she began, her voice hesitant. Have you noticed Jake's been working a lot lately? You should keep an eye on him, you know. Don't let him take you for granted. I turned to her, surprised. What do you mean? She sighed, looking suddenly older. Men, sometimes they get restless. They forget what they have at home. Her words sent a chill through me. Was she speaking from experience? I wanted to ask, but something in her expression held me back. That night, as I lay in bed waiting for Jake to come home, Sarah's words echoed in my mind. For the first time, I allowed myself to consider the possibility that something might be wrong. When Jake finally crawled into bed in the early hours of the morning, I pretended to be asleep. He smelled of cigarette smoke and, was that perfume? My stomach churned, but I kept my eyes closed, my breathing steady. The next morning, I made a decision. I couldn't live with this uncertainty, this growing doubt. I needed to know the truth, whatever it might be. With shaking hands, I picked up my phone and searched for private investigators in our area. It felt wrong, a betrayal of trust, but the alternative, living with this gnawing suspicion, seemed worse. I found a highly rated agency and made an appointment for later that week. As I hung up, I felt a mix of relief and dread. Soon, I told myself, I would have answers. Whether I would like those answers was another matter entirely. The detective's office was small and cluttered, with files stacked haphazardly on every surface. The detective himself, a grizzled man in his 50s, introduced himself as Mike. I laid out everything, the late nights, the weekend work, the subtle changes in Jake's behavior. As I spoke, I felt a weight lifting off my shoulders. It felt good to voice my fears, to have someone listen without judgment. All right, Mike said when I finished. Here's what we'll do. We'll track his movements for a few weeks, see if we can establish a pattern. If he's up to something, we'll find out. 3 weeks later, my phone rang. It was Mike. Mrs. Thompson, I think you should come to my office. I have some information for you. The drive to his office was a blur. My hand shook as I parked, and I had to take a moment to compose myself before going in. Mike was waiting for me, a thick file on his desk. His expression was grim. I'm sorry, Mrs. Thompson, he began, and my heart sank. But your suspicions were correct. Your husband has been unfaithful. He pushed the file towards me. With trembling hands, I opened it. Inside were photos, text messages, hotel receipts. Evidence of not one affair, but several. Jake had been seeing multiple women, juggling them with what appeared to be a carefully planned schedule. He's been meeting them at various hotels, Mike explained gently. Always on different days of the week. It seems he's been doing this for quite some time. I stared at the photos, unable to process what I was seeing. There was Jake, my Jake, with his arm around a blonde woman I'd never seen before. Another showed him kissing a redhead outside a restaurant. My stomach churned. I left Mike's office in a daze, the file clutched to my chest. As I drove home, tears blurred my vision. How could Jake do this to me? To us? What about our vows, our promises? When I pulled into our driveway, I saw that Jake's car wasn't there. Of course not. It was Thursday, according to Mike's report, that was his night with the blonde. Sarah was in the living room when I came in. One look at my face, and she knew. Oh, Natalie, she said softly. What happened? I couldn't hold it in anymore. I collapsed onto the couch next to her and told her everything, my suspicions, hiring the detective, what I'd learned. Sarah reached out, gently taking the file from my hands and setting it aside. Her eyes, filled with a mixture of concern and determination, met mine. You need to rest, dear. You can't make any decisions in this state. A clear mind is what you need now. I nodded numbly, allowing her to guide me to my feet and towards the stairs. As I climbed each step, I felt as though I was moving through molasses, my body heavy with the burden of my newfound knowledge. We'll talk more tomorrow, Sarah promised as she saw me to my room. Try to get some sleep. Sleep, however, proved elusive. I tossed and turned all night, my mind replaying every moment of my marriage, searching for clues I might have missed. When dawn finally broke, I gave up on rest and got ready for work. Work was a blur. I moved through the day on autopilot, my colleagues' concerned glances bouncing off the protective shell I'd built around myself. As the office emptied out for the evening, I remained at my desk, unable to face the thought of going home. It was dark by the time I finally left, the streets quiet as I made my way back to the house. As I turned onto our street, a strange sight greeted me. The garage door was wide open, and I could hear the rumble of an engine. Suddenly, Sarah came tearing out of the garage in Jake's pickup truck, the tires screeching as she swerved onto the street. My heart leapt into my throat as she barreled towards me, but at the last moment, she slammed on the brakes. "Natalie," she shouted, her voice sharp with urgency. "Get in the car. Now." Bewildered and alarmed by the wild look in her eyes, I obeyed without question, scrambling into the passenger seat. No sooner had I closed the door than Sarah floored the accelerator, the truck lurching forward with a roar. In the rearview mirror, I saw Jake burst out of the house, his face contorted with rage. He ran after us, shouting and cursing, but Sarah didn't slow down. We tore down the street, leaving him behind. I turned to Sarah, my heart pounding. "What's going on?" I demanded, but the words died in my throat when I saw her expression. She looked terrified, her knuckles white as she gripped the steering wheel. We drove in tense silence for what felt like hours, but was probably only about 30 minutes. I didn't dare speak, afraid of breaking Sarah's concentration as she navigated the darkening roads. Finally, Sarah pulled into the parking lot of a roadside diner. She scanned the area carefully before killing the engine, her body still tense. "Come on," she said, her voice low and urgent. "We need to talk." Inside the diner, we slid into a booth in the far corner. Sarah ordered coffee for both of us, her eyes constantly darting to the door. When the waitress left, Sarah leaned across the table, speaking in a hushed, frantic whisper. "Natalie, listen to me carefully. We're in danger. An hour ago, I overheard Jake on the phone. He was talking about getting rid of us, Natalie. Both of us." I stared at her in shock, my mind reeling from her words. The idea that Jake could be planning to get rid of us seemed too outlandish to be true. Sarah must have sensed my disbelief, because her expression shifted from fear to determination. "You don't believe me," she said, not as a question, but a statement. Without waiting for my response, she reached into her purse and pulled out Jake's phone. "I found this in his car when I was leaving. Look for yourself." Together, Sarah and I huddled over the small screen, scrolling through Jake's messages. My heart sank as we came across a conversation with someone labeled NH Director. As we read, the truth of Sarah's words became clearer. Jake wasn't planning to kill us, but his intentions were far from innocent. He was in talks with the director of a state nursing home, discussing ways to have Sarah declared incapacitated and admitted against her will. "Oh my God," I whispered, quickly searching for reviews of the nursing home. What I found made my blood run cold. Neglect, abuse, unsanitary conditions, the stories were nightmarish. I looked up at Sarah, who seemed relieved. But as I read her some of the worst accounts, Sarah's relief turned to anger. "That's not living," she spat. "It's a slow death. It might as well be murder." But Jake's betrayal didn't end there. As we continued to scroll, we found messages to multiple women, his mistresses. The sheer number was staggering, but what hurt the most were his words about me. "Once Mom's out of the way, I'll leave Natalie," one message read. "I'm tired of playing house. I want my freedom." I felt sick, but forced myself to keep reading. copying the messages to my email as evidence. Sarah and I sat in disgusted silence, the weight of Jake's betrayal hanging heavy between us. Finally, Sarah spoke, her voice thick with emotion. "I should have seen this coming," she said. "Jake's father, he cheated on me too. 4 years. He even had another family, 2 kids I didn't know about until it was too late." My jaw dropped. "Sarah, I had no idea." She nodded sadly. "I turned a blind eye to it all. I loved him, and I was afraid he'd leave us if I confronted him. I hoped Jake would be different. That seeing his father's mistakes would make him a better man." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "But he's been this way since he was young. Always charming, always with a new girl on his arm. I lost count of how many hearts he broke. When he married you, Natalie, I thought he'd finally grown up. I was so happy." I took a deep breath. "I'm going to divorce him. I can't stay with someone who would do this to us." Sarah nodded, understanding in her eyes. Then, to my surprise, she began to cry softly. "Please," she whispered, "don't leave me. I can't face this alone." Without hesitation, I moved to her side of the booth, wrapping my arms around her. "I'm not going anywhere, Sarah. We're family, and we'll get through this together. I promise." As Sarah and I sat in the diner booth, emotionally drained from our discoveries, I felt a weight pressing on my chest. There was one more piece of news I needed to share, something that complicated our situation even further. "Sarah," I began, my voice barely above a whisper, "there's something else you should know." I took a deep breath, steeling myself. "I'm pregnant. I found out just this morning at work. I don't know what to do." Sarah's expression hardened, a fierce determination replacing her initial shock. "I'll tell you what we're going to do," she said, her voice strong and resolute. "We're going to fight back. Jake doesn't get to destroy our lives and walk away unscathed. It's time we took control." We paid for our coffee and headed back to the truck. The drive home was tense, but filled with a sense of purpose. As we pulled into the driveway, I saw Jake's car parked haphazardly, a clear sign of his agitated state. Taking a deep breath, Sarah and I entered the house. Jake was pacing in the living room, his face contorted with rage. As soon as he saw us, he exploded. "Mom, what the hell were you thinking, taking off with my truck? And my phone? Have you lost your mind?" Before Sarah could respond, I stepped forward, my heart pounding but my resolve firm. I held up the file from the private investigator. "Jake, we need to talk." His eyes darted from me to the file, realization dawning on his face. For a moment, he looked panicked, but then his expression smoothed into one of cool indifference. "So, you know," he said, his voice eerily calm. "What are you going to do about it, Natalie? Divorce me?" "Yes," I said, surprised by the steadiness of my own voice. "I want a divorce." To my shock, Jake laughed. "Come on, Natalie. You're overreacting." So I had a few flings. "It doesn't mean anything. You're not enough for me, but we can make this work. You can stay, be a good wife, and I'll be discreet with my extracurricular activities." I felt a surge of anger and disgust. "You must be joking. I don't need a Ravella like you in my life, Jake. We're done." Jake's face darkened. He pointed to the door, his voice low and menacing. "Fine. Get out. This is my house, and I want you gone." Before I could respond, Sarah stepped forward, her chin raised defiantly. "Actually, Jake, this is my house. I own it, and I decide who stays and who goes." She took a deep breath. "And I'm telling you to leave. Now." Jake's jaw dropped, disbelief written all over his face. "Mom, what are you saying? I'm your son. And Natalie? She's nothing to you." Sarah's grip on my hand tightened. "You're wrong, Jake. Natalie is like a daughter to me. She's family." Then, with a pointed look at me, she added, "And she's carrying my grandchild." Jake's eyes widened, darting to my stomach. For a moment, hope flickered across his face. You're pregnant? Then I can't leave home. The baby needs a father. I shook my head, my resolve stronger than ever. This child doesn't need a father like you, Jake. We'll be fine without you. Sarah nodded in agreement. You heard her, Jake. It's time for you to go. We'll have the locks changed in the morning. Jake looked from Sarah to me, realization dawning that he had lost this battle. Without another word, he stormed upstairs, presumably to pack his things. As the sound of his angry footsteps faded, I turned to Sarah, overwhelmed by the events of the day. She pulled me into a tight hug, and I felt the tension begin to leave my body. The months following that fateful night were a whirlwind of legal battles, emotional turmoil, and new beginnings. The divorce proceedings were messy, as expected, but with the mountain of evidence we had gathered, Jake didn't stand a chance. I sat in the courtroom, my hand resting protectively over my growing belly, as the judge delivered her verdict. Jake's numerous infidelities, coupled with his attempts to manipulate Sarah's living situation, worked heavily in my favor. The judge's stern voice echoed through the room as she awarded me a substantial compensation package. Mr. Thompson, she said, her eyes boring into Jake, your actions have been reprehensible. This court finds in favor of Mrs. Thompson and orders you to pay compensation for emotional distress. I watched Jake's face contort with anger and disbelief. For a moment, I felt a pang of sadness for the man I thought I had married. But as I caught Sarah's supportive gaze from the gallery, I knew we had made the right decision. After the court proceedings, Sarah and I sat in her kitchen, our kitchen now, sipping tea and processing the day's events. I've made some changes to my will, Sarah said suddenly, sliding a document across the table to me. I skimmed the paper, my eyes widening as I realized what I was reading. Sarah, you can't. This is too much. She reached out, clasping my hand in hers. Natalie, you and that baby are my family now. Jake, he made his choices. I've disinherited him. The house, my savings, they're yours and my grandson's now. As my due date approached, Sarah and I spent our evenings preparing the nursery. One night, as we folded tiny onesies and arranged stuffed animals, Sarah turned to me with a serious expression. Natalie, she said, her voice soft but determined, I want you to know that we're going to raise this boy right. He's going to grow up to be a man who respects women, who understands the value of loyalty and honesty. I nodded, feeling a lump form in my throat. You're right. He won't have his father around, but maybe that's for the best. He won't have to see that negative example. Sarah's eyes misted over. I made mistakes with Jake. I let him see his father's behavior and didn't do enough to counteract it. But this time it'll be different. This little boy will grow up surrounded by strong women who won't tolerate disrespect or infidelity.